Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another ServiceNow Express video blog post. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of an LDAP integration with ServiceNow Express. Now, I'm joined here today by one of our developers who worked on that LDAP integration, Chris, and we're going to be looking at how we can set this up to quickly get the user provisioning process and identification going through an LDAP connection. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is search LDAP in the upper hand navigator, and we're going to pull up that LDAP module under authentication. What this will bring up is a simple visual interface that shows you any LDAP servers you currently have defined, the certificates used for authentication with those LDAP servers, and some generalized configuration settings used across all of this LDAP integration. From these generalized configuration settings, we can see an item such as use LDAP for password authentication, which will allow your users when logging in to enter that LDAP username and password information to successfully be granted access to the instance. We also offer provisioning through the automated import if the user is not in the sysuser table, paging for the retrieved results, as well as the amount of time the listener will wait, after which it will time out. So why don't we get started here, Chris, and let's define a new LDAP server. And I think you're familiar with some of the fields we're going to have to fill out here.
Yeah, absolutely. So first we'll enter an arbitrary name, just a name that we can use to identify this LDAP connection. So for this instance, we'll actually just say test LDAP server. Here is the actual URL in LDAP format. Next, we need the actual login distinguished name. This is the LDAP username that we'll be using to access the LDAP server. Next is the login password of the actual username that we'll be using to make that connection. And last but not least, it's the starting search directory of where we'll actually be looking in your LDAP server for your users or groups. If you want to use SSL with your connection, you can enable that here. For the purposes of this demo, we will actually have it disabled. Active, you can turn this LDAP connection and LDAP integration on or off. Underneath advanced settings, we have the ability to control the connection timeout, so how long it actually takes us to initially connect to the LDAP server. We also have configuration settings for a read timeout, so how long it takes to actually read data from your LDAP server. We also have configuration options for paging, so therefore we will actually, when retrieving data from your LDAP server, we can do it one page at a time. There's also configuration settings here for using a listener. This is for typically when you use an Active Directory connection, you can actually enable a listener. So when changes occur within your Active Directory, those changes will be propagated to your instance and we will grab them and update your users or groups. And you can also configure a listener interval for how many minutes between each check for new data. So from this point, I filled out all the information I need for my LDAP connection. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. The system will actually verify that my connection is valid and allow me to move forward. If the connection is not valid, you'll receive an error message with information about how to correct the problem. Now, once we've set up an LDAP server connection, we actually need to set up our organizational units, or OUs. So I'll go ahead and click Add New OU. The options I see on this screen first are the active flag, so whether this is actually an active OU. Next is a name, which again is very arbitrary. So for this demo, I'll use the name users. The table is the actual target table where I want to import this data from this OU into. So since I'm going to actually import users, I want to actually target the user table. RDN, we can actually use the little helper button here to actually browse the server to search for our RDN. In this case, I'm actually going to leave it blank. The query field is the actual field on the LDAP object that we actually want to query for. So in this case, and for most Active Directory connections, it will be the account name. Our filter helps us narrow the user or the types of objects that we want to actually retrieve from this LDAP OU. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and test and save. From here, the system will actually test the connection to this individual OU. If it's successful, it will go ahead and save the OU to the database and create a data source for importing this OU into the instance. So as you can see, we have saved successfully. From here, I can go ahead and edit the transform map. What this transform map allows me to do is actually map my fields from my LDAP OU to the target table, which we have selected as the user table. So for this demo, I'm just going to map a couple fields. Okay, now that I've mapped my 2 fields, I'll go ahead and click Next. On this screen, we actually decide which of those fields that we just mapped are the primary keys. So basically, we can actually control how the system is going to look up the user when importing it to find a match. If the match is found, that user record will be updated. If a match is not found, that record coming in from LDAP will actually be inserted into the target table. So in this case, I'll use the username. Go ahead and click Save. Okay. Now that I have my field mapping set up, I'm clear to actually transform and load this data from this OU into this target table. I'll go ahead and click Transfer and Load. And my load is successful.
So Chris, another thing I see on this configuration page is the Enable Scheduled Loads option. Can you let me know exactly why I'd want to enable scheduled loads and what that'll actually do for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course we don't want to do just a one-time load of our OUs. We want to actually give the users the ability to load data on a scheduled basis. Therefore, when data is updated within our LDAP systems, we want that data to be propagated over to our systems at a time that we choose. So here we have the ability to enable scheduled loads. So if I click on Enable Load, I have options of when to run these scheduled loads, daily, weekly, monthly, or periodically. So for this instance, I will actually choose periodically. So I can actually say, I want this scheduled load to run every 1 day, 12 hours, starting on a date of my choosing. Go ahead and click Save. Allow the system to verify all the information I just entered. And we're good to go. Now this LDAP OU will be updated periodically every 1.5 days, starting next week.
That's great, Chris. And I think another important note is the fact that you really can select exactly what table you're sending that data into. So it's very common to send in group data, department information from your AD or other LDAP enabled interface. And that really lets you take the data you already have and push it into ServiceNow. So with our LDAP connection set, our OU definition for users defined, we're going to go ahead and press Done. As we can see, now on our LDAP servers window, we see that LDAP server is successfully connected. It's important to note again for that automated provisioning of users that we just set up through that users OU, per that coalesce logic, if no match is found, it's going to be importing those users when this is enabled to true. But if this was false and per that coalesce logic, a match was not found, there would be no user created. Is that correct, Chris?
That's absolutely correct.
Excellent. So in most cases, you are going to expect and want this toggle to be set to true. And that takes care of the LDAP integration without the SSL, but in most cases, you are going to enable the SSL for added protection. And to do that, simply toggle that SSL field on the LDAP configuration and make sure you do have a valid certificate stored. You can go in to add a new certificate and define exactly what the format is, PEM or DER, and exactly the type of certificate it is going to be, such as a Java key store or a private key, and so on. With our LDAP successfully configured, it's important to note that sometimes it won't be successful. In that case, you can easily come over here to see the monitor server status and understand exactly what is currently running, where the connections are, the current parameters passed through, to identify exactly where the issue may lie. This completes today's video on the LDAP integration in the Helsinki version of ServiceNow Express.